Hello everyone, it's Mr. Lichty here, and before I get into the lesson I wanted to give you guys today, I just want to kind of quickly iterate what is going to be going on and how notes are going to be structured in this class. So to keep it very simply, I'm going to keep Mr. LaFountain's system of giving you guys some notes that you have to fill in the blanks in. The only difference is really going to be that I have more of a storytelling format to it. So mine's, rather than bullet points, you're going to be able to read through it and be able to read it almost like a textbook, hopefully, by the end of it. Now, these notes are going to be directly related to the Google Slides or PowerPoint that I am also going to upload for you guys to look at your own pace. And I'm also hoping to upload little video lectures like this so that, if you're not the best or have a hard time just kind of understanding the PowerPoint, you can hear me kind of explain it for you. In addition to that, what I think will be very nice about that is if you miss a day in class just for being, sick or absent for some other reason, you can always fall back to the Google Classroom where I'll have all these materials still available for you. So yeah, hopefully we like this system. It works for us. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to let me know. My email has been posted on Google Classrooms, and, just come to me if you have any questions. Now, without further ado, I think it's time we start looking at a little-known country called Japan. Now, we could start at about 1920, with the Great Depression, but I'm a history buff. I don't think that is nearly as fun. No, I want to go a little bit further back than that. And with that, we need to look at exactly where Japan is on a map. And if you look closely, it may seem like Japan, this little red landmass right here, is very far away. When in reality, remember, no flat earthers are allowed in this class. The Earth is spherical. And when you take that into consideration, Japan is actually one of the closest countries to the United States, Besides Canada and Mexico and, maybe like Russia over here, Japan is very, very close. And now, as you can imagine, will come into play a lot later on. But what I want you to know right now is when you look at Japan right here, you notice that it is completely surrounded by water. And because of that, people are going to have a very hard time getting into Japan. And with people having a hard time getting into Japan, the Japanese people are going to become pretty accustomed to that. They're going to not really, look forward to meeting new people, and will be a little bit hostile to any new people that end up entering. As we go to about the mid-1500s, Europe is starting to go around the world. They've already kind of started entering into North and South America, and new routes are forming across the world, eventually reaching Japan. Now, the Japanese, as we kind of touched on already, they weren't very welcoming of them. And since, the 1600s, they would actively try to keep as many Western ships away. They didn't like the British coming in and telling them that the religions that they had were wrong, or that, they were just had these barbaric, in quotes, systems of government. They liked what they were doing, and they just did not want to change. And with that, we have to look at what the system they had long before the 1600s was. And going all the way back to the 1100s, some of you might remember what a feudal system is. So a quick little recap on that. In Europe, we had this system of classes. In Europe, though, it was a little bit different than what we see in Japan. We had the peasants at the bottom, the nobles, the knights, and then the kings, right? Well, in Japan, they had very similar things, although the names were a bit different. Some of you might recognize number 3 there, the samurai. The samurai were basically the equivalent of the knights in Japan, and it's actually kind of interesting how similar these two different areas ended up being without ever knowing the other existed. Have you ever felt kind of weird whenever someone comes into school and they're wearing the exact same shirt as you? It's kind of off-putting, and you kind of wonder what happened that exactly happened. Now imagine that with an entire system of government and an entire way of life. It's really crazy to think that could happen, and, maybe people just aren't so different after all. But more to the point, when you look at the peasant class there, everyone above them for this Japanese feudalism chart was considered part of the warrior class. They had a very big, predisposition, which means, they like to gravitate towards a more warrior lifestyle. They prided themselves in being fighters and being able to stand for their own. Now, keep that in the back of your head. We have to fast forward a little bit. It's 1853, And this picture right here was drawn by a very famous Japanese artist. If you look at it, you're going to notice a lot of things going on, and it does seem like a bit to take in. The big important thing to note here, though, is out in the water. In the water out there, you have a bunch of little vessels, little boats being hand-paddled up to this giant, menacing war machine that many of these people probably had never seen in their lives. And an important little detail here is that little flag right there. If you look really closely, that looks a lot like an American flag, doesn't it? Well, there's a reason for that. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned that Japan is actually really close to the United States? Now, keep in mind, Japan was wanting to keep their trade to an absolute minimum. They did not want to deal with Europe. They didn't even want to deal with people as close as China. They just wanted to mind their own business. And what we call something like this is isolation. Keeping in isolation means you keep to yourself. Don't worry about anyone else. You don't care about foreign affairs. You're more worried about what's going on in your own soil. And that's all well and good. Until a little-known country, maybe you've heard of them, the United States, they began wanting to grow. And one way for them to grow was to expand their trading. Now think about it. Before this, Britain, France, they had all of these colonies, and, they called dibs on a lot of them. The United States needed to look to new places where they could have, kind of first dibs of their own. And with that, they needed to get into Japan. And they appointed a man named Matthew Perry. He was the guy that was put in charge of ultimately making this happen. And he came up with this idea, and it's a pretty famous one, actually. It's called gunboat diplomacy. Now, gunboat diplomacy is a bit unique in the sense that it's not really diplomacy. It's not really even negotiating or, being nice to the other person. What Matthew Perry decided to do was he took a fleet of America's top-of-the-line iron steamships, those new things that were top of all the rage now, and wanted to sail straight into Japan. I want you guys to understand that Japan, because they were living in such isolation, that term again, they hadn't experienced anything on the outside world. They hadn't seen any of the inventions of the Industrial Revolution. They hadn't seen the ideas of any enlightenment. They were kind of in their own little island, much like the Native Americans when the Europeans first came. Now, the Japanese knew that the Americans were coming, and they were waiting there with over 1,000 people, because they wanted to show the United States that they could stand up for themselves. I just realized that was the wrong picture of Matthew Perry. That's a different Matthew Perry. Let me pull up the not-so-pretty one right here. And some of you might want to know, if you guys have ever been to Put-in-Bay, the guy named Oliver Hazard Perry was a hero of Lake Erie. This guy was actually his grandson. Hopefully, the genes have gotten a little bit better since then. Now, more back to topic. Japan, with their 1,000 troops, were clearly the largest force there. But when these steamships came in, just barreling into the harbor, they were awestruck. They had never seen these steamboats or like the rifles that the Americans had. And they didn't really understand what they were looking at. In fact, many of them described them as giant dragons puffing smoke to show you just how in awe they were. When Perry first came in, he demanded to meet the government officials. He wanted to see the guy that was in charge. And the Japanese, initially, before Perry ever got there, were probably not willing to do that. But the people that were present at the harbor, seeing these massive, bellowing beasts coming at them, they didn't know what to do. So they were almost reluctant, but they were too afraid, and just let let Matthew Perry go in to meet the officials. And he was eventually brought to the Japanese emperor himself. Now, you might think Matthew Perry is coming into to meet the Japanese emperor. He wants to scare him too. That's not what Matthew Perry wanted to do. What General Perry wanted to do was kind of introduce the Japanese to some of the great things that America had to offer. And he brought many little gifts for them, like a little working model of the steam train, and some other inventions like the telescope and the telegraph, just to let Japan know what the Americans had to offer them. And after that, Japan opened its ports to the entire world. Well, not necessarily the entire world, but mainly the United States. That's not to say the Japanese were very happy to do that. In fact, they were very, very, very worried. If you guys might recall, in China, the Europeans had kind of split it up and were causing a lot of chaos for the Chinese people. And Japan were vaguely aware of what was going on here. They did not want the same exact thing to happen to them. And many of the, richer people in the Japanese systems, the upper class, mainly like the samurai, the big warriors, they wanted to do something about it. They didn't want to be under the boot of like these American overlords that are coming in. They wanted to stand up for themselves and make their own. And what they decided was that they eventually needed to industrialize, just like in Europe. This was prompted by a specific emperor named Meiji. And the big thing with this was that they wanted to industrialize, but they wanted to keep it Japanese, keep the Japanese spirit, but bring in those new Western things. The best of both worlds, right? Now, when you industrialize, a lot of the poor people don't really like it. The peasants that had been working the land, farming, they didn't want their farms to just be taken away. So we see a lot of, the poorer people trying to stop this, but the emperor managed to hold them back, and Japan began to industrialize like crazy. We're talking they had telegraphs up after just about 20 years all across the country. And every major city in just 20 years was connected to a railroad. That's impressive. They had really gotten to work on this. And after seeing all of the great successes that Japan had made, they decided, they were probably ready to start going toe-to-toe with some of these other major countries that were there. And with that, they decided that, Japan doesn't want to be like the United States. They don't want to be like Europe. Japan wants to be Japan. And when they tried to decide, how Japan should be, they looked back to that culture. And that culture was that of the warrior. Looking back, they thought, just like many of us do, that the samurai, they were pretty awesome. And the way that they carried themselves, they had honor and dignity. And they wanted to go back to that. So we see this active, attempt to bring back this culture. We're going to be just like we were. And the specific name of this culture, you can keep in the back of your head. It's called Bushido. It's the Bushido Code. Now, in Europe, the knights had something called chivalry. You guys might have heard it, hold the door open for the woman walking in. Bushido is the exact equivalent of that. Knights practice the code of chivalry. Samurai practice the code of Bushido. So, after that, we see Japan start to readopt these very same ideas. And with that, they started taking them into a more aggressive stance. If you're going to be a warrior, you got to start fighting more. And they ended up deciding that they wanted to get some more land in China. And so, they go into China, they start invading, and they absolutely destroy the Chinese. I don't want to go into details about that specific war. I just want you guys to know Japan saw immense success, and they thought it was all because they had gone back to their Bushido ways. Now, if some of you are kind of interested in exactly what Bushido is, I have a little chart of some of the quote-unquote virtues that many people that would follow this would have to practice. Feel free to pause this and take a quick look at it. I don't think we need to go over it in detail, but it is pretty interesting. Take your time and enjoy it. Alright, back on topic. We see Japan getting more confident than ever. They had a massive victory in China, and they did to China what the Europeans had done to it. They were being able to keep up with all of these other countries, and decided to do the same thing in another part of China towards the northern area, and Korea and Russia in 1905. They're getting very aggressive. They are looking to get as much land as they possibly can. They initially asked Russia if they could have, Korea for themselves. And Russia, they didn't want to give it up. It's a nice piece of land. You wouldn't want to lose your cool stuff, right? So after Russia rejected the Japanese offer to hand it over peacefully, Japan immediately attacked. They were not holding back, and they crushed the Russians. And after about 5 years of fighting, they ended up taking all of Korea for themselves as well. Now, Japan did have a lot of cool gadgets. They had started building their own steamboats. They had better weapons. But all in all, they felt all of their successes was undoubtedly because of their new Bushido ways. They had successfully started becoming the warriors that they once were. And you keep seeing these different codes that you looked at being ingrained into everyday Japanese lives. And fast forwarding a little bit, you might notice we're at about 1910 right now. We're going to go up to Japan during World War I. Now, you might think that, there's a world war going and that many countries would probably be having a hard time. That wasn't the case for Japan. Though many nations were actually struggling during World War I, Japan was doing great. Things couldn't have been better at that time. Japan was actively trading to people in the war, selling their goods to both sides, not really taking a side, giving, some warships to, like, the United States, maybe giving ammunition to the Germans. They were profiting very, very well. And while everyone was kind of busy, in Europe for the World War, Japan kind of got free rein to do what they wanted in Asia. And so kind of like while Europe and the United States and all these other countries are fighting, while they weren't noticing, Japan was kind of just doing their own thing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as they kept getting stronger, they were looking to be more and more recognized by these Western countries. They wanted the United States to know how big they were. They wanted the British. They wanted everyone to know that Japan was a force to be reckoned with. Now, I think that's going to be it for this part of the video. What do you think is going to happen to Japan after this? Japan's feeling tough, once the World War is over, they're doing better than they ever have. Do you think that success is going to last? Why or why not? Keep that in the back of your head. There's going to be a second part of this video. Feel free to watch this tomorrow. Or if you want to get ahead, you can just watch it right after this and continue the notes. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'll see you next time.